World of Warcraft hot takes. Everybody has some, and I reached out on Twitter, or X, the everything app, to try to find some of your World of Warcraft hot takes because I was interested in making a YouTube video like this. As it turns out, most of you guys don't know what a hot take is, and you just honestly responded with pretty balanced opinions. I thought this was pretty funny. Not that many hot takes, but I did round up some of the most interesting ones I thought would make for good discussion point content, and we're going to take a second to kind of talk about some of your World of Warcraft hot takes. From Roundhouse to the Face, he says, remove the power to form groups from the players. I'm so tired of sitting in queue for an hour trying to get into a key because people haven't slept since patch day. So complaining about people being too sweaty is kind of an interesting issue, I would say. Not exactly necessarily a problem, but some people are going to be playing since patch day and have 658 item level and 4 set, and you're not, and you're going to be John, who's just come home from his job and is not going to be able to get even into a 10, even though he probably should be able to get into a 10 because he played a lot last patch. Here's the thing. I don't think that removing agency of forming groups actually solves necessarily anything. I kind of see this a lot whenever people talk about solo queue Mythic Plus. And I do empathize with the concept of players struggling to actually be able to get into groups, especially whenever you're playing a DPS. It's really difficult to get into a group, so you want a solo queue, right? Because you feel like being declined because of your item level, because of your class, because of last season's IO, because of these factors that you feel like aren't in your control. And while you are qualified for the key you're signing up to, you're not going to be selected because you're not overqualified. This is the nature ultimately of LFG, because you're very rarely going to be invited to a group because you're appropriately qualified, but you need to be overqualified to actually be invited to a group. That's why whenever we're giving advice to people, we kind of tell them, especially whenever we're talking about the bench or whatever, people ask, how do we make groups? The best thing you can do, or how do you get into groups? The best thing you can really do is just make your own group. That's the only surefire way of doing it. I don't think that removing the power to form groups actually does anything, and I actually do think that a solo queue would be a little bit long-term more harmful to the player base. I don't think that LFG is a perfect solution, but I think that LFG is a better one-size-fits-all solution for the fact that players generally have different interests whenever they're doing Mythic Plus. Whenever you're doing Mythic Plus, you have a lot of different interests, such as, am I doing this for gear? Am I doing this for score? Am I doing this for my 3k IO achievement? Am I doing this for KSM? Am I doing this for 10 for portals? Am I doing it for weekly vaults? And so having players with different interests, it's really difficult to make a one-size-fits-all system, and I don't think that a solo queue would really work that well. And so I think that removing the power to form groups from the players would just end up yielding just a worse system as a whole. And I think that anything that would actually separate that player base into multiple different systems would end up making you actually sit in LFG, or you're sitting in queue for a lot longer, which would be way, way worse. If I actually have to end up sitting, if the queue time to get into a dungeon went from an average of, I don't know, let's say 15 minutes to an average of 45 minutes, that would feel just way worse for every single player involved. Sin says, the removal of AUG is healing the video game. I don't know if it's necessarily a hot take, but it's kind of interesting, and I wanted to take some time to talk about this. AUG being absolutely erased from the meta by virtue of pretty aggressive class tuning is funny. Not exactly the way that a lot of people thought that they were going to be looking to balance it, but Blizzard actually didn't go with a balancing approach. They went with a deletion approach. I think that this actually opens up the meta game for DPS and Mythic Plus a lot more than it has been in the past. We're kind of talking about multiple very good compositions being potentially viable this season, where there's a wizard comp that involves a mage, a moonkin, an Ellie shaman, a disc priest, and a Avenged demon hunter. That's one composition that seems like it's pretty good. Then on the other side, there's some prot warrior composition that's prot warrior, mistweaver monk, and then you play enhancement shaman, fair druid, sub rogue, and that composition is also probably going to be pretty good. The issue with AUG Evoker is whenever you start with one overpowered specialization, the best thing that you reasonably can do is add an Augmentation Evoker to it as well. And it kind of creates this really weird dynamic where AUG was just super polarizing and taking over the game in a way that players didn't enjoy. And so I don't know if the game is necessarily healing, but I do think it's going to make for a much more diverse season in terms of DPS meta. Sunderwire says, might not be a hot take, but why do they have to remove the free heroic tier piece for hitting 2k Mythic Plus score /AOTC? They should be giving us 1x catalyst charge a week. I don't know about how I feel about this. So realistically, I suspect that Blizzard thought that players were getting too much free loot too quickly, right? Getting a free heroic piece of gear that also includes a tier set bonus on it was actually a pretty high value thing. And it's not necessarily even like they took it away. They just moved it to the catalyst. Now, I'm not arguing that it's the same. I think that the catalyst is almost strictly worse than the AOTC token, but I actually think that it's still like a pretty good system, all things considered, and not something that I think is too bad. If Blizzard, I suspect that Blizzard thought the pacing of gaining gear was just a little bit too fast whenever you had access to this fully free AOTC tier piece, and they just wanted to tune it down a little bit. Now, by gating it behind the catalyst, of course, you have to then get the piece of gear. You could, in theory, get it from like a myth track source, and so you have an extra catalyst charge. That's not necessarily how most people are going to use it. They're going to end up using it on a heroic piece of gear. So now you have to go through this process where you're actually getting that off slot before you were looking to catalyze it. I suspect that's what's happening. Also, as for they should be giving us 1x catalyst charge a week. I don't think we should be getting 1 catalyst charge a week. I think 1 every 2 weeks is totally reasonable. It's one of those things that if you look into the past, it's actually kind of funny because Blizzard didn't start the catalyst whenever it first came out in Sepulcher. They didn't start the catalyst until week like 8 or 9 or something like that, and that was ridiculous. And now people are like, yeah, they should be giving us a catalyst every single week. I don't think it needs to be like that. But I do think that like every other week is totally fine with the catalyst. Everybody's going to be able to have access to pretty good tier pieces, and you get basically 2 catalyst charges as the season starts for free. I think that gearing is easier than it ever has been, especially whenever you have to factor in professions, gilded crest, item upgrades. You don't even have to raid if you don't realistically want to. If you just want to be a Mythic Plus only player like myself, you absolutely can. Dread Fury DK says, a few hot takes. Talk about augmenting a race, immediately improving PvE. We already covered this. Removing the actual heroic tier piece from AOTC/2K is a massive L. We also already talked about this. The thing that I want to cover is Windwalker being absurdly strong in raids isn't bad. Aspect's been bad for so long it deserves a huge spotlight. And I think this is a pretty common opinion where they're not exactly about Windwalker Monk, but they say that about any specialization, particularly the one that they play more often than not, where they're like, my spec sucks for so long, it's their time to shine, don't ever nerf them, you're allowed to be absurdly strong if you've been bad forever. I don't agree with this. I think that Blizzard also probably doesn't agree with this, but here's the thing. I don't think that Windwalker should be as strong as it is currently, but I think that it's allowed to be the best specialization in the game. And Blizzard will probably, hopefully, do this thing whenever they go and tune specializations, where whenever they reduce the power of the spec, let's just use Windwalker Monk for this example, where they reduce the power of Windwalker Monk, and then they don't nerf it into the ground, but they leave it as still the best specialization. I think that there's a way of appropriately tuning this to where it remains the best spec, but it's not super overtuned, right? And it's about the top to bottom delta. Right now, the top to bottom damage differential from specializations is actually quite large, particularly in raid. I think I'm seeing like around a 20% damage differential from top to bottom on Warcraft logs whenever you're kind of looking at the stats. It's not a great metric just in general, but more often than not, Blizzard kind of tries to keep it between like a 10% delta for raid DPS. Now, this is not true for Mythic Plus. AoE is the least balanced shit in this game by a substantial amount. And I actually wish that Blizzard would balance AoE DPS a lot better than they currently do. I don't think I agree with the Windwalker being absurdly strong in raids isn't bad. I don't think that any specialization should just be so dominant that you feel forced to reroll to it. Although I don't think that Windwalker is like unique in this situation. I think that it's cool that Windwalker, a specialization that's not normally super popular, is being played. But I think that the amount of strong that it isn't great. It's kind of the same reason that, you know, whenever you use God Comp in Mythic Plus in Season 2, there's a reason that you wanted all the specializations nerfed. It's because whenever they become super strong, they become very polarizing to the point where you feel like you are required to reroll to them. If you're watching Liquid play 3 and 4 Windwalkers on a boss, it's not going to feel good whenever you're playing literally anything else, because you know that the best thing you can do is rerolling the Windwalker Monk. Nature is Scary says, too many mechanics require melee to move out of range after taking away 8-yard melee range. I don't know if this is necessarily a hot take. I actually don't know that they should bring back 8-yard melee range to all the melee DPS. I think the best thing that Blizzard could do is probably give like 2 more yards on every single mob's hitbox. That would probably be an effective solution, because I tend to agree that visuals, particularly in Mythic Plus, whenever you have multiple mobs pulled, are pretty hard to see. Now, Blizzard's doing a better job this season of trying to make the visuals easier to see just in general. And they're doing a good job, but they didn't do that necessarily for some frontals and some cone style effects. I don't think it's perfect by any means, but I do think it's at least getting a little bit better. I think the hardest part about Melee, particularly in Mythic Plus, isn't necessarily the mechanics, although I do think the mechanics are hard. I do think it's just genuinely hard to see what the hell is happening in Melee sometimes whenever you have a bunch of mobs. And I think that is like a problem that they should probably be looking to solve whenever they're creating the mechanics on the mobs themselves. As for circle style effects that force Melee to get off the mobs, in my opinion, as long as they're not overdone and they're actually forcing you to get off the mobs for any extended period of time, I actually don't think they're necessarily that bad. The only one that really comes to my mind right now is the second boss in Rookery, how that boss can actually go into a sequence where it leaps on the ground out of melee, and then it does immediately into a circle, which again forces you to get out of melee. That seems stupid. And whenever you have 8 seconds of continuous downtime, that's dumb. But in general, just the circles that the mobs do by themselves, like say the Priory of the Sacred Flame paladins with the consecration circles, that seems fine to me because you're able to actually continue to do DPS. That's just a mark of being like a really good melee player. Melee DPS love to tell you about how hard they have it in Mythic Plus. And in general, melee DPS is just harder than ranged. That's just factually true. But it's not actually that much harder than any other role in Mythic Plus, and it's sure as hell not as hard as tank or healer. The Blue Wave says, not necessarily Mythic Plus based, but I think role-based tier sets are a massive W and allow for much easier balance / a wider variety of classes to be played. I hope they continue to do them, and it seems way better for them to take the 3 best ideas instead of having to pick 39 unique ideas every single tier. I don't think I necessarily agree with this, but I do see where this person's coming from. Here's the thing. I play a bunch of casters who primarily have the Jackpot tier set. I don't think the Jackpot tier set is especially fun. Whenever I log on my Warlock, I get some Demon Fire Bolts for Destro. Whenever I log on my Moonkin, I get some Wild Mushrooms, which are completely passive procs. Whenever I log on my Evoker, I get an Upheaval, again, completely passive proc. I don't think the Jackpot feels especially great for any of the specializations that I'm playing. And so I think that whenever they went with super generic, I think it kind of ended up limiting creativity. You see this with the tank one as well, where they proc their major defensive, like their shield wall, and they gain 15% damage gained. I just don't think that what they selected was necessarily good. I don't know if I think that it's bad because it's role-based, or if I think it's bad because what they selected wasn't particularly fun. But I do think that they're both a combination of one another that's kind of skewing my perspective to not enjoy them as much. I think the alternative of what they had, where they were very clear as to how the tier sets were going to be positively or negatively affecting your rotation, I actually liked that. And I think that some of the cooler tier sets, involve that level of creativity with what was going on with your rotation. Whenever they have to create something that's generic, sometimes, yeah, of course, it can actually impact your rotation in some capacity. But more often than not, it's going to end up having to be like a more generic style effect that just has your proc listed into it, right? Where I also think that they created a lot of the 4 sets around the 2 sets in the Jackpot this season, which I think that for me, and I don't know this necessarily to be true for all specializations, but for the ones that I play, I don't like a lot of the 4 sets, and I think that that's almost directly attributable to what the 2 sets are. But anyways, those are your World of Warcraft hot takes. I actually enjoyed doing this. This is kind of an interesting video. I hope to... What's up? Good night.